Welcome to Games Growth with Upptic, a podcast about the discipline of scaling digital games. We speak with industry experts and investigate trends to highlight the strategies, technology, and tactical methodologies you can use to profitably grow your game to a massive global audience. If you're interested in learning more about Upptic's games growth services or technology, visit us at upptic.com. My name is Xander Gosta, Director of Marketing here at Upptic, and joining me today are my co-host,
Warren Woodward, co-founder of Upptic.
And our guest,
I'm Shamanth Rao, CEO at RocketShip HQ.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Shamanth.
Yeah, Shamanth, it's great to have you on. One of my favorite people in the industry, and someone who also makes great content. One thing I love about your content, Shamanth, is all very practical and actionable. There's there's some content in our space that's got a lot of hyperbole and small talk, but your content is all very high value and very usable. So really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's, for the selfish reason that I'm also a practitioner and, I do the podcast to learn as much.
Awesome. Well, we can just jump right into the sort of meat of the episode. We got quite a few different topics to cover. I think it all sort of boils down to what are sort of some of the most modern growth levers. I'm not sure if that's the exact right way to frame it, but what are the different things that we're seeing in terms of mobile UA today? What are some of the creative trends? What are some of the analytics? And what are some forward-looking trends? So I think we can dig into all of that and see how it goes. Just to get started, Shamanth, can you tell us a little bit about your background, what RocketShip HQ is, and what you guys are focused on right now?
Yeah, so RocketShip HQ is a boutique creative and user acquisition agency. My own background's actually been extensively with gaming. Was lucky enough to be a part of 3 exits. One by GSN, one by Zynga, one by Gameloft. So I was like, before it goes south, I need to get out of here. So I did. So I started RocketShip about 4.5 years ago, and been fortunate enough to be working with a number of very exciting projects. Done a lot more work on creative lately, as I was telling Warren, and I'm sure we'll talk about that just as well. So really, I think that's been a big part of what we do lately, creative. Yeah.
Awesome. Do you want to talk a little bit about, so we have some context about the profile of the clients you work with, just so we understand what your perspective is? I mean, obviously, Upptic, we focus on gaming, hence the name of the podcast, but I want to get an understanding of what your client mix looks like.
Yeah. Like I said, a lot of our clients hire us for creative production only. That's UGC and Ad Creative. We also do a lot of work on the subscription app side, and we do work with a couple of games on the user acquisition. But the creative's been a bigger piece lately for everything we do.
Yeah, and I always think it's really cool to get perspectives of people that work on growth outside of gaming segment. There can be a little tunnel vision, even though there's a lot of diversity in games. I learn a lot when I talk to people like Shamanth that work on kind of like broader portfolios, more in e-commerce, subscription. There's a lot of tactics you can learn that are like maybe tribal knowledge in one segment, but aren't tested in others that transfer over sometimes.
Certainly.
So I guess like zooming all the way back out, I'm sure Warren has opinions here, but anyone who listens to the podcast knows our opinions on this fairly rigorously. We've been covering it for the last several weeks. What is your current state? What's your current perspective on the state of mobile UA, Shamanth?
Yeah, never a dull moment, right?
Sure.
Yeah, right. I would just say definitely this has been happening for the last year or two, right? Since ATT, measurement is broken. Something I've said to multiple people is just because measurement is broken doesn't mean performance is. And it's certainly something we see. I think we just have to say goodbye to, some people still ask me, can you tell me exactly which creative is winning? And I'm like, no, that game is over. You can't look at that. It's a little more frustrating when people have Android apps and they point to Android and say, you can do this in Android. You can't do that on iOS. And I'm like, yes, you cannot do it. You cannot pinpoint with exact precision exactly what's happening on iOS, right? So, but, in terms of the state of modern UA, measurement is certainly broken, perhaps irreparably so. I don't think we're going back to that. Performance, I think, is not as broken as it's held out to be. There's definitely a number of channels and apps that we see that are doing well. The number of apps, again, Warren, to your point about other verticals, right? So the number of subscription apps that we work with have grown month on month. And I would say that's primarily driven by the fact that a lot of subscription apps are very scan friendly because the trial happens within 24 hours. right? A lot of games I know that they've had to scramble to put in an event in the first 24 hours. They've had to sort of, engineer their game around the scan schemas. You don't need to do that for any subscription app because 95% of trials happen in the first 24 hours. And
Right.
it's very scan friendly. And I would go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it's worth, for our listeners that are maybe less in the UAE, just kind of like talking through practically what we're saying about like this edge that subscription apps have, because a lot of the limitations around scan is you don't get like clear lifetime value, but you get a better picture of what's happening in the first 24 hours specifically. So
Yeah.
if you have a subscription app where the main monetization decision is in the first 24 hours, you actually have very clear versus say like a free to play game where the monetization is gradual over 90 or 180 days. What you get if you only get day one is not going to tell you very much of the full picture. So that makes a lot of practical sense why subscription apps could have an edge right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think one of the things you were interested into digging in on first is around creative and some of the creative trends you're seeing, and also some different perspectives, some of the programs you're running there. So again, start sort of all the way zoomed out and say, what are some of the most effective creative trends you're seeing from mobile UA within your portfolio, and just sort of discuss a little bit about, why do you think that is, and we start from there.
Yeah, definitely. A couple of things we're seeing that on creative would be UGC. Certainly, it's been in vogue for a while now, but we're continuing to see that take over a lot of the ad spend. In fact, I think just in the last couple of months, we've seen a lot more gaming folks gravitate towards UGC. And I would also add that with gaming, it tends to be less like a skit that works for a lot of subscription apps or lifestyle apps. For lifestyle apps, it's more like problem solution. Here's how the product fits into my life. It's almost like e-commerce, right? With games, I don't think it's quite the case because it still needs to be intertwined with the game itself. You can't show the creator and not highlight the game in ways that work for other verticals. So definitely, I think UGC is definitely number one. Number two is I would just say what I like to call satisfying or soothing stuff. Really, it's funny that there was this gaming ad that we were looking at. We didn't make this, but we certainly used it for inspiration. It was, I think, called Makeup Master. The name escapes me, but it basically showed somebody shaving. I was like, and we've seen that sort of ASMR soothing, satisfying thing happen a lot.
The oddly satisfying videos.
Yeah. The oddly satisfying videos, right? So, even for like shooting games or strategy games that we've made creatives for, we try to borrow from that because there's ways where you can show, there's a strategy game we're working on where you're supposed to shoot and mow down your opponents, but we show that in a very soothing, satisfying way. And that in and of itself works very, very well. Right. And of course, the other big trend, I'm sure we'll talk about this, is just generative AI. Certainly, it's something we're using to generate more ideas, particularly on creative.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. I think, you're laser focused in creative right now. It's a leg of what we do. But we've definitely found for some of the games we're working on, particularly if we see that TikTok and Snap are like the highly viable channels, UGC ends up, user-generated creative ends up taking up a disproportionate amount of our production cycles because it just tends to be what takes traction. And those channels are also hungry beasts. They want fresh stuff all the time, and it's got to be very trend focused. You need creators that are like very plugged in. You can't not do like copy paste concepts for that. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And we've been having fun with AI too. Also just doing intentionally bad AI ads, like kind of uncanny valley stuff where it's clearly AI and kind of the hook is like, look at this weird AI ad. That's been fun. Shamanth, I wanted to kind of going back to your first topic about talking about, perfect measurement, kind of the era of perfect measurement being dead, or at least, it's not the era we're in right now. You and your business have really doubled down on creative in this phase. And I would just love your perspective of like, as a founder, like why this was an important moment in the ecosystem of like, hey, let's really double down on creative as a focus of our business right now.
Yeah, I would say for us and, for just a lot of marketers, like I said, measurements being broken. And we see that it's just, with creative, it's an easier decision for a lot of marketers to make because creative is important. It's also more of a turnkey thing than measurement, where that has involved a lot more people on the client side for us, right? So I would just say primarily because creative was much more of a turnkey thing. Uh, and of course, we did see some budgets get cut down on the UA side. We still do quite user acquisition, but certainly creative took much more of a priority because of these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've definitely, we're not that old of a business. We're Upptic's about 4 years old, and we see these macro trends in the industry where there'll be like, quarters where it seems like every team we talk to is like, oh yeah, we're not concerned about creative. We just want to talk about UA, almost like they see it separately. And then we'll see these periods, and I've been seeing this
Yeah.
anecdotally and talking to teams lately where it's like, yeah, let's talk about creative. Like we really need creative help right now. It's almost a combination of groupthink plus just the macro tides in our industry of like,
Yeah.
okay, you
Yeah.
pointed out a good one, which is like, I don't know what the hell is going on with my measurement right now, but I
Yeah.
know or believe that creative will help, and I've seen how creative improves
Yeah.
performance in the past, so I want to focus on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes it interesting. TikTok is always a hot topic on the Games Growth podcast with Upptic. I don't know if you've ever listened, Shamanth, but my take is that TikTok is sort of dangerous to the U.S. economy, but that's neither here nor there. One of the things that I've heard that you're working on is you're working with the TikTok Creator Program, and I'm really curious if you can articulate what that is and how important that's been to your business and sort of what that's meant for sort of the downstream effects of how you're working with other clients.
Yeah. All right. The TikTok Creative Exchange Program, that's the full name of the program, but
Sure.
basically it lets advertisers get free creative on TikTok if they work with a TikTok partner like us. And really, they get free creative if they're able to commit to a certain level of spend. There are different tiers, but it starts at 20K a month. So if they're at that level, then they sort of write to us and we get them set up with TikTok. Right. So, and I think it's just a win-win all around because a lot of folks that have worked with us through the program are folks that were reluctant to try TikTok. And also, I think, Warren, you mentioned it's also that TikTok creative is a heavy lift for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. So, even the setup on TikTok is not as much of a problem. The fact that it's a new channel can be a little bit of a risk, but not too crazy. But getting the creative ready can be both a heavy lift and expensive. And just getting free creative in return for committed ad spend solves a lot of that problem. I would also say for us, it's a lot easier to produce some of these creatives just for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, we've done this for close to 2 years now, so we have a dialed in process. We have direct relationships, so we can do this. The other, I think, very important difference is that we work with not micro influencers or influencers. We work with actors. These are basically folks in New York and LA that have day jobs but want to do something in the evening to earn a little extra money, right? The advantage of that is we are able to direct a shoot with super precision. You say, this is exactly the hook I want. This is exactly the what I want you to say at second five, and which honestly helped us a lot with a lot of brands where they needed a lot of brand oversight and scrutiny. They're like, oh, our brand team needs to approve. And, every time we go to
Yeah.
influencer, they just say something that was not in the script and it just didn't get done. And we're like, we can give you second by second direction of exactly what's going to go in. And that has helped, right? And again, because these are actors and we direct them, they're not anywhere as expensive as influencers. A TikToker
Yeah.
with million folks, yeah. Really,
Yeah. There's a couple things I want to kind of double back on that you just touched on, Shamanth. I mean, the first thing is like, I think it speaks to the power of creative that TikTok as an entity is saying like, look, we will literally pay for pay for teams such as yours and like essentially sponsor game teams to do creative at no
yeah.
cost to them. Because I mean, TikTok has a massive amount of data. They know it's a rounding error for them to know that like, hey, if we just empower these teams with better performing creative, it's going to allow them to profitably spend on our platform. It's going to increase their ad spend. It's going to be they know that they're going to, or at least their thesis is, and I don't think they would go this hard on the creator program if they didn't have data to back this up. If we essentially stipend teams to have more creative following best practice by proven teams, they're going to invest more in our platform because they know how much it's going to improve performance. So I think the fact that TikTok sponsors an initiative like this shows how much the data has panned out for them that creative can turn around the campaign. And we've hands down seen that. I mean, I came out of a meeting with one of our clients today where we talked about how we got a breakout video on TikTok that it was an older game and have the CPIs all of a sudden, just like you find that one thing that works on the network, cost of acquisition goes in half, profitability doubles. Doesn't mean that every creative does that, but that's the power of when you find a breakout.
100%, 100%. We've seen that with, just a couple of folks who came into the program in Q4. They've continued spending and increasing spend in Q1, even though they were not even on the platform earlier.
Yeah.
And that's huge. Like Warren, you pointed out, some of the CPIs are crazy on TikTok. So definitely it can be huge.
The other thing I want to dig into a little bit with you is the strategy you've done. We work with smaller teams, we worked with bigger brands, and we've ran into this blocker sometimes in trying to do user generated creative for bigger brands of wanting approval of every word. And there's a tension, right? Because for UGC creative, it's got to look supernatural. So do you feel like you played with the formula for a period of time where you've kind of established like, okay, we have a go-to kind of group of talent where we can give them something scripted, but it still has that very natural feel? Or are you actually finding that you can do more scripted content that feels a little more professional and staged that still works well? I'm curious how you landed on this model, balancing those tensions.
It's just because it's scripted, it doesn't have to be professional and staged, right? And again, the advantage of working with professional actors is that, they know the kind of tone you're wanting for the ad, and they're going to set that. And we're also noticing that the designers can make a huge difference, because oftentimes it's like the way the cuts are stitched together, if you can have a very fast transition between different shots of an actor and make a video look really good, just the overlays. So I would say it does not have to look professional and staged. If anything, we make sure the part of our mandate to the actors is to have it not be professional and staged. We want for it to look candid. But because we are able to script this out in a lot of detail, we are able to get past the brand teams with relatively, there are always cases where the brand team comes back at the end and they're like, oh, on second thought, this wasn't such a good idea. We shouldn't have approved it. But I think that's much more of an exception when we are able to give them a clear script upfront.
It's interesting. The faux authenticity is it's a really interesting concept, because you're seeing, one of the other things that I'm curious to talk about a little bit is sort of the TikTokization of all the major acquisition channels. So like YouTube has YouTube Shorts, Instagram has Reels, Facebook has their own Reels product. If you go on Reddit now, it turns into a TikTok feed if you click on a video. Yeah. So I'm curious to just talk a little bit about that. Like, how do you feel that what have been sort of the second order effects of this TikTokization of all the different major acquisition channels? Is it that these tactics work now everywhere, or what's the implication?
Yeah, definitely, right. So we've definitely seen these work on Meta, and for sure, a lot of the TikTok ads, they port somewhat seamlessly to Meta for sure. UAC is a little bit more of a weird beast, but certainly we've seen some of the UGC ads float to the top over there as well on UAC as well. So definitely there's TikTokization. I would also point out that a lot of the fundamentals of creatives don't get TikTokized, if you will, right? So again, as I was saying, with games, you still need to hit on the big user motivations, right? If you're like, look, this is we're working with a casino game, and we're like, you have to show the casino game, you have to show a big win. You can't show dance that is sort of independent of what's happening in the casino, right? We're working with a different dress-up game, and it has to be not just fashion-oriented, but it has to be fashion-oriented and show the game and tie into the exact kind of transformation that is echoed by a lot of the non-UGC ads, right? So I would say the TikTok versions of the ads are basically you take a non-TikTok version and layer on and keep the gameplay in. I think that's sort of the formula, if you will. So certainly what has worked outside of TikTok does not go away, right? It just needs to be adapted.
Right, that makes a ton of sense. Well, one of the other topics you referenced sort of at the top, and I think would be worth touching on now, and it's also the topic that everyone's just talking about everywhere, whether or not we want to hear it, is generative AI. So talk a little about generative AI, how it works into your creative process. We'll start there, but then I'm also very curious to sort of think blue sky and think about where this could go in the future? Because I think, there's a lot there potentially to unpack.
Yeah, right. And like it is probably for a lot of people, our process is still a work in progress with regard to AI. But that said, a couple of things that I'm seeing changing is marketers are much more involved in the creative process with the help of creative AI. And that's just because now marketers have more of a language to speak. Like, in the past, the best that marketers could do was scratch out a doodle or write a one paragraph description of what they want to see and hope that the designer imagines what they had in mind. Now the marketer can give a very clear visual reference for exactly what they have in mind and what they would like to see, which is huge, right? And so I would just say having more ideas on the table, I think that's a big piece of what generative AI has been able to do uh, in the creative process, right? And yeah, I would just say, it's not at the stage where finished creatives can be readied at this point. Uh, but I would just say definitely, this is going to get even more slick and polished as we move forward.
I want to dig into the last thing you said, which I think is an interesting and perhaps counterintuitive statement that, that AI creative is not at the stage it can be used. I actually agree with you, but I don't think that's the narrative right now, because I see both, both in ads and actually content, actually used for other parts of games marketing, or like, we would do work in Web3, sometimes the NFT collections themselves, more and more AI art being the thing that you're encountering, and it's
Yeah,
high quality. It looks
yeah,
great,
yeah, yeah,
but as we all know, anyone who does like UA creative performance work, like looking great is very different from something that performs. And there's kind of like a fancy yet bland feel that where you can be like, that's an AI creative,
yeah,
and it doesn't
yeah,
have that. It's almost because it's following every single best practice, that it
yeah.
lacks some passion or clickability. Is a trend that I've noticed.
100%, right? And some of the elements we talked about, right? So one that oddly satisfying, it's just hard. I mean, not impossible, I would say, right? But it's just hard to, at least at this stage of AI's evolution, to have that be created by AI, or a hook in the first 3 seconds, an overlay hook.
Yeah.
Again, you could argue there's chat GPT that can come up with catchy phrases that you can plug into your hook, but it's still something that needs some amount of curation, if you will.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
should clarify, like video is obviously still, it's evolving quickly, but video is at a more primitive stage. For months now, you've been able to do very beautiful static AI images, and teams are using those for ads, but I don't think those are being very effective, for these
Yeah,
reasons we're talking about.
yeah, yeah,
I'm curious
yeah,
just to get kind of granular for a little bit here and talk about sort of what specifically, because everyone talks about it sort of in the generic sense. I'm curious if there are any tools that you're using and sort of what the specific use cases are, or if you're working with clients who are using what tools they're using. So like personally, I've used ChatGPT. I kind of use it a lot now, which is strange. I don't use it like for marketing copy, but I do use it sort of like in the concepting, and like if I'm working on a complex problem, I will use it as like prompts to sort of get my mind going, or I'll use it to answer sort of like
yeah,
really concrete stuff. And in that regard, it's often better than Google, like just in
yeah,
that sense itself. And it took me, I think, I basically started in December. It's been 3 months, and it took me really like several months to get to the point where I can interact with it in a way that I actually think is fairly effective for me now after like 3 month period. When I personally engage with image creation, I'm like stonewalled. Like I can't really get it to produce what I need when I do image generation. And I'm just kind of curious, what are the tools and techniques and sort of where you guys are, if either of you are using this, where are you in sort of that lifestyle of understanding how to use these tools in your actual workflows today, or your clients potentially?
yeah, right. So it's still very early on. We've mainly stuck to the big ones, really. We've just, I would say, just DALI and ChatGPT. But really, the ways we've used these are, you know, to identify different dimensions of what we could do. So, just as a quick example, right? So, there's a wellness app we're working with just now. We want to identify the visual depictions of the different dimensions of what they're about, right? So, we're like, oh, let's see. How are there different ways that we can show being stress free? One of the images we got was that showed sleeping well. Another image was showed that showed waking up energized, right? So we translated those into different icons, which could go into icon tests. And you can imagine something with a sun and a moon or a watch are three very different visual directions to test, which, again, to be honest, we wouldn't have thought of upfront at all without these prompts, right? So I would just say it's much more around visual inspiration. And I know the team is playing around with some video tools this week as we speak. So ask me next week, and I'm sure we'll have more to report. So far, it's just been, it's been mainly around generating ideas and images that we sometimes oftentimes hand off to designers who are working on the videos, and that's our current workflow. But like I said, it could change next week. We are test driving video tools this week.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. It sort of aligns with the way I've seen it used in my personal workflow and with other people I've spoken to as well. It seems to be like pretty good at like a first draft and like getting the ideas flowing. It's not to the point yet where it can pull through and do the kind of polished creative that Warren was talking about at the top. And in some regards, it reminds me a little bit of, I'm going to throw shade in there, Warren's favorite thing, the crypto boom of the last year, which is people were talking about crypto is going to take over everything in every possible capacity. We're going all in on Web3 and that's the future and that's everything. The reality is like there's actually some interesting stuff there, but it's not everything, right? And there's like what you have to do is figure out the places where it's componentized into the workflow that's useful, and that's where I think we are. But I think we are in like the hype phase of AI for sure.
You kind of stole my thought there, Xander. What I was going to say is like it can't, for most, it's not fully replacing jobs yet for a lot of the functions we're talking about, but it replaces batches of work, and that's what I've seen our own creative team experiment with, is kind of breaking down their production into like, well, we do A, B, C, D, and E in a production flow, and say like, well, let's swap out part B, which might be like a script idea, and let's swap out part C, like the read of this. Let's swap out part D, which is like a AI actor, and kind of experimenting, mixing and matching, and having fun playing with that. But you can't, you can't go front to back, come up with a brilliant concept and spit out, all of the aspect ratios for every ad network on the other end.
Yeah,
I have it on good authority that our creative team uses it to write headlines. So don't tell our clients. Just joking. Clients, we still screen them. We still screen them.
No one's listening. No one's listening. It's all right.
If you ask the ChatGPT to spit out headlines, you're going to get 10, and one of them will be good, right? So you still have to use it.
It's great for brainstorming.
You have to curate it. You have to curate it, right? Exactly.
And in that regard, it's incredibly useful. I found it incredibly useful, surprisingly so. I've basically 180'd in 4 months on generative AI. Like basically in December, I was like, it's all garbage, and now I'm like using it a lot, and that says something.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit. Let's say first, is there anything else you want to touch on the creative front before we move on to talk a little bit about analytics and the future of analytics?
No, let's jump in. Yeah.
Cool. So, I think you did touch about this a little bit, Shamanth, already, but I wanted to just get your perspective on sort of what is your de facto measurement methodology in the post-ATT scan world? It sounds like for your book of business, you're mostly using scan and like the early conversion values for your measurement methodology. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're using scan. Again, we can get into some of the nuances of this just because I think part of the problems is that the measurement landscape is broken. But when you say de facto, I think the single most fundamental thing we do is report on blended metrics, which, it pains me to say can be a little bit of a struggle for a number of folks still. They want to know, how is my Facebook doing? And I'm like, I can tell you how it's doing. I cannot tell you with a great deal of precision about how it's doing. I can tell you if it's good or bad. I can tell you whether I would recommend increasing or decreasing it. I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly how much it added to your bottom line. So I think the number one de facto thing we do is use blended as a source of truth. It's funnily enough, we do a lot of reporting based on App Store Connect numbers, just because there's a number of things around MMPs. We use the MMPs, but there's a number of things around the metrics there that aren't as, rock solid as App Store Connect. I would say fundamentally that's the thing we do, blended and App Store Connect, and I'm sure we'll get into the nuances of the other things that have changed as well.
That's an interesting point. That's something that I haven't heard a lot of teams doing. But I mean, one thing that we always tell our clients, because at the end of the day, you have to model for iOS somehow. You have to estimate, you're not going to get the granular performance the way we used to. We have our own methodology and tooling we've built around that. And, the approach our team takes, I think, is a little non-traditional from others, where, we're basically using kind of like a dynamic polling methodology, polling like every micro segment of players for the people that agreed to be to spend and then applying that to the rest. But at the end of the day, we're doing some modeling. I think what you said of just gut checking against what the stores are paying you, like ultimately, okay, you're modeling, but that, hey, how's my money in the bank? Like I think in any model, what you need to do is just still gut check against your cash flow. And like if you are using like predictive LTV and it's telling you everything's going to the moon, but yet the company's bank account is empty, which is like a situation I've definitely seen before, then something is wrong. So I think it's important. Yeah, we always recommend like just be in touch with the finance team. Like, is cash flow actually improving as your UA efforts say it's improving? So good practical tip.
Yeah, 100%. You know, I think I had a podcast episode about a couple of years ago that was titled "LTV is a made-up number." And I believe it because you can't make payroll next month. Whatever LTV you have is meaningless, you know, and it's certainly something I advise. Also because, you know, again, just to get into some of the channels, because your original question is just around scan, right? So we use scan. Part of the problem is not everybody uses scan, right? Google uses Firebase reported numbers. After all these years, they've refused to adopt scan. A lot of ad networks use probabilistic fingerprinting, however you call it. Apple Search does not use scan.
Right.
And you're like talking four different languages with four different networks, you know, and each of them is a language of its own. None of them is wrong, but none of them is comparable, which is really what had us use App Store Connect and Blended as the source of truth. And we also build our own models, which we can talk about as well. Right. So really, I think that part of embracing that complexity and realizing that you just can't compare four different languages to each other.
That's a great point worth like restating. And, you know, we've talked about it on the podcast before, but it's like, that's the thing about iOS right now is if you're running a dozen channels, you're going to have at least, you know, 3 or 4 wildly different measuring methodologies between the fingerprinting networks, Apple Search, which hilariously doesn't follow Apple's own, you know, measurement infrastructure, and self-attributing networks. And the variability we see in our model is like with a network like fingerprinting, you might be within, call it 5 to 20%, which is still meaningful of what the likely real world revenue was, you know, if you account for the users that are not tracked. But then you look at the SANs, self-attributing networks, Facebook, Google, et cetera, you might be missing, like we find it's very common that there's like additional 7 to 9x of your revenue, or to put another way, that you're only tracking $1 out of every 9. And if you don't have a way to model that out, and importantly, look side by side, you still have to decide at a portfolio level where my next dollar goes. iOS and Android, all these channels with different methodologies, like it's a friggin' mess. So it's like, yeah, we've definitely had to over resource our engineering resources of just like making something viable to pull all those things together. And, you know, we've got there, but it's a lot of work because it's a mess, right?
Yeah, it's also just a mess because, you know, to convince people that aren't accustomed to speaking 4 different languages.
Right.
So they're like, you know, if there's a CFO I'm talking to, that's like, I want to know if I want to invest in Google, right? And they're like, Google metrics are amazing. And I'm like, that's because Google uses Firebase and they count their own homework. And you can't trust them if they count their own homework. And, you know, it's just a longer conversation. I would say a lot more people are coming around to embracing this complexity and understanding this complexity. It was just much harder a year ago, but I think now everyone knows and is clear how all of this works.
Yeah, the CFO still needs to know how to pay, you know, the office rent next month, and saying like, well, I'm going to run this model, and in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be able to give you a predictive D80, D180 LTV. Like, are we going to be profitable this month? Can it pay the bills? You know, like you still have to answer those practical questions.
Yeah.
So there's a couple other things we can dance around here, and I think we might have beaten them a little bit, so maybe we can move quickly. I know Warren's thoughts on mixed media modeling. Shamanth, I'm curious if you have thoughts on mixed media modeling, and to what extent, if any, you use it in your portfolio with your clients.
Yeah, we do use this for many of the larger engagements that we work on. You know, really because of what we just talked about, which is you can't compare multiple channels, right? And when you say media mix modeling, you know, there's a couple of extremes that are out that people talk about in terms of One is, hey, you need to be Coke or Nike to be able to use it, or you need a SaaS tool to be able to use it. We actually don't go on
Mhm.
down either of those paths. We do use a DIY implementation that is run completely by non-engineers on our team just now. We did have, engineers that we consulted with that had put together a model. We used Facebook's Robin, by the way, right, which is an open source protocol by Facebook. It does not privilege or favor Facebook just because the code is all completely transparent. We know exactly how it works.
Right.
Right. So after we had our consultants set the model up for us, we have people on our team run the model, and it's great. And again, I sort of put an asterisk next to the great because at lower levels of spend, it's not very helpful.
Right.
There are multiple caveats.
Mhm.
But it's hugely helpful in giving you an additional source of truth that is
Mhm.
probably much better than the four different sources that you have. It provides a bridge that between the four different languages, the multiple different languages that you have on the different platforms, right? And I think that's been the biggest part of media mix modeling, right? And I think the biggest advantage is you can get the true value of every source, right? So if you're like, look, here's Facebook, Scan says so much, here's Google, Firebase says so much, we can say, okay, actually the CPA on Facebook is 20. This is the true value based on what historical trends. And here's how Robin works: is basically it looks at all your past revenue increases, says past revenue changes, revenue decreases, spend decreases, install
Mhm.
changes, install decreases, and over a long enough period of time, it can make enough correlations and say, okay, when Facebook went up, revenue went up, so we think it's kind of correlated. The other caveat also is you cannot do that at a very granular level. You can't say, oh, I added this creative, what happened? You can't. If that creative only got $50 a day in spend, it won't show up enough to move the needle, even if it actually did. That's sort of how we've been using media mix models lately, but I'm
Mhm.
happy to dig into any of the details or specifics as well.
No, I think that's great insight. And the thing that's fun about this era is there's many paths to success. I think the thing we always tell teams to do is A, do something. Don't throw up your hands and wait for a perfect solution. And also like share tactics, because like we're in an undefined era, which means we all have to work harder, but it also means like it sounds bad, but you don't have to be perfect right now. That's the thing that we've really found on iOS. Like we have a strategy that's super effective for us. Do we believe that there's zero holes in it or zero ways that you can improve it? Yeah, absolutely not. But one thing that we're finding is like it's really fun to do iOS UA right now once you get a viable strategy, because CPMs are actually down, competition is lower, so you can have a margin of error for success right now because we have this kind of unprecedented moment since the beginning of mobile, which has basically been like a one-way street for 90% of mobile's existence of CPMs get higher, the
Yeah,
arms race for UA tactics gets
yeah,
more intense, and then it just fell off a
yeah,
cliff and everyone's just scrambling, testing, trying their
yeah,
tactics.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's just dive in. Like, the thing that works for Shamanth and RocketShip, like a different approach from what our team took, which is a different approach from what other teams have taken that have found something that works. But it's satisfying when you get a breakthrough. You'll beat your head against the wall for a while. But yeah, that's, I'd say my main advice is like, you don't need to be perfect. Just find a good enough way to make through kind of these very favorable market conditions for iOS buying right now.
Scan 4.0 exists now. We don't need to dwell on this very long, but I'm very curious, Shamanth, if you think that there's anything meaningful here, or is this something that it's going to take a while to implement, not super meaningful in terms of moving the needle? Just trying to get a pulse on how you
yeah.
feel this, how impactful this is going to be over the longer term.
Yeah, right. So I don't think it's going to be hugely impactful because, yes, there are three post backs. Yes, there's like the course conversion value, but really the first post back is still the most meaningful. Uh, that does not change. It does not go anywhere. So I would just say the improvements are just marginal, I would say.
Yeah, and that's sort of the, I think, general assessment from most of the industry who has not yet implemented it. So it's a good gut check to hear. One last thing to touch on here before we move on to our sort of last closing trends. Google Privacy Sandbox is supposed to roll out very soon. TM. We'll see. We'll see how soon. Any thoughts on what that's going to mean for the ecosystem? How you
Yeah,
plan to prepare for it? Anything in that regard?
yeah, I've read through some of the documentation, right? It's definitely much more transparent than iOS, which is hugely reassuring. And
Well, there's
also just when we
documentation. That's a good start.
oh yeah, that's definitely a great start, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. So you know at least how things are supposed to work. Some of it, like topics, for instance, it's hard for me to imagine how it's gonna be actually effective because it seems very, very limiting. So I would be curious to see how the actual implementation looks like. Also, just because I know and understand Google is not going to want to kill the advertising ecosystem because that's what
Right.
pays their bills. But at the same time, Google will very, very likely privilege their own network, as they've always done. So, on paper, I remain cautiously optimistic that it's not going to be so ham-handed as iOS has been.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, Google ultimately leans on their ads business a lot more than Apple does for a percentage of their revenue. So yeah,
90
whereas like
plus.
yeah, I think Apple has been very resilient to do anything drastic to reverse the impact of their decisions. I think that's part of why we've seen more caution with the rollout of Google's privacy solutions.
Yeah.
So moving into our last topic, sort of forward-looking trends, there are sort of two main questions I want to talk about here. One is, Shamanth, I want to get your perspective. There's a lot of rumblings now about the U.S. making some moves against, trying to ban TikTok. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how do you rationalize if that's noise or if it's not, and what that would mean for the UA ecosystem at large.
Yeah, right. So, you know, I would generally have said, oh, TikTok's too big to be shut down, but also India has shut down TikTok,
Right.
right? And they've had, I think India was among TikTok's biggest markets, and it's completely unavailable there just now. Uh, so I'm not ruling out what any loony politician can do. I do think I think US can be less ham-handed than India can be. India's got like internet shutdowns
Sometimes.
sometimes depending on
Depending on the
yeah
topic.
different topic different topic yeah right but yeah so I'm somewhat wary of what might happen. Obviously that would be a huge disruption to everything in growth, marketing, user acquisition. Uh, so certainly something I'm wary of and keeping an eye open for.
Yeah, yeah. Warren's been, I mean, it's such a critical component of our growth mix now. It's from the perspective of a game developer, it's very hard, or a game publisher, someone who's actually advertising UA, it's very hard to root for TikTok to be banned.
Well, to your point
Yeah,
earlier, Xander, I think TikTok has provided despite what any political views on the parent company, just from a content and engagement experience, like it's sort of proved unparalleled, and now everything is becoming TikTok to some degree. So I do think even if TikTok as a brand disappeared from the US, TikTok as far as an experience, like it's such a massive gap and opportunity, like it will pay off to master creative tactics that work on TikTok, because something like TikTok, if not TikTok itself, is going to be omnipresent in our lives for the foreseeable future. And so, mastering that type of marketing,
yeah,
which is very different from traditional user acquisition, is going to
100%.
be
Yeah,
worthwhile.
yeah, and like I said, a lot of those creators work on other platforms too. So if you
Right.
have a strong hook, super fun creatives, it's platform agnostic in many ways.
What trends are you looking for in 2023, and how do you expect to position yourself in your business and mobile UA to take on those trends?
Yeah, right. So I think the big ones really, we've touched on many of the big ones during the rest of this conversation, really. Right. Generative AI is a big one. That's certainly something we're investing a lot of time and energy into. Right. The other big, again, TikTok, we've talked about quite a bit, and it's certainly a channel we've been doubling down on. And it's been a big reason we've doubled down on the creators, right? On, again, iOS, I think it's going to be more of the same measurement mess. And I don't think there's going to be a clear-cut solution, but it's certainly something that's going to continue. But I think just have, like Warren, you said, having a solution is better than having none. So it's certainly something we're going to try and continue to figure out to the best we can. And I know you guys are releasing a product, I think the week before this podcast is going to be released. I know you gave me a little bit of a lowdown on it. I'm actually excited to see your webinar and the release and see what we can learn from your product. And yeah.
Well, we're very excited to show that product to you. So don't you worry about that.
Yeah, certainly.
Well, Shamanth, really appreciate you hopping on the podcast with us, giving us lots of wisdom around a wide variety of topics. If someone wants to get a hold of you or learn more about RocketShip HQ, where can they do that?
They can go to rocketshiphq.com, one word, obviously, or they can check out mobileuseracquisitionshow.com. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's 4 words. And we have a weekly podcast. We go into all things mobile user acquisition. And something we also just started recently is a newsletter with creative inspiration. And I'll send you guys the link. It's called The Daily Ad, rocketshiphq.com/daily-ad. Really what we do is we have a tagged and categorized database of creators, which we share instances from. So for instance, this week is like, here's how lots of games used endless runner creatives for games that have nothing to do with endless runners. Right, and that was a cool example that we just sent out this week, and it's something that people could check out as well. It's called The Daily Ad, and I'll send you guys the link after it.
Well, awesome. I'm going to go subscribe to that right now.
I was going to say, if there's any audience that actively wants ads to show up in their inbox every day, it's probably ours, because we're definitely students of that and love to monitor trends. But yeah, Shamanth, thank you so much for joining us. Always one of the people I love to touch bases with. Shamanth is a very forward thinker, very adaptive with the work of him and his team. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today on, where the space is in this moment of time and where it's going.
Certainly, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Xander. Thanks, Shamanth. So as always, the episode today is brought to you by our team here at Upptic. Here at Upptic, we do all things to help games grow. Traditionally, that's been like full service work where we do UA, we do creative, ASO, data modeling work. And that's kind of how we built the roots of our business. And, as Shamanth alluded to, we recently rolled out basically a software version of what we do that even small teams can license, which we think is important in this era where a lot of teams are operating off shoestring budgets. Ad spend is down. You need like very cost efficient tools, even for small teams. So if you want to learn more about our software or how our team can help you, you can reach us at upptic.com. That's upptic.com.